Okay, well, Lenin wrote this little pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, at the beginning of 1920. He finished it in April 1920. And it was an incredibly significant time for the revolutionary socialist movement. 1919 was arguably the closest we've ever come to seeing capitalism being overthrown across its heartland in Europe. And even though by early 1920 the revolutionary wave was beginning to ebb, meaning the chances of insurrection were becoming slightly less likely, there was still a politicisation running like an electric shock through the working class, reflected in the development of mass communist parties. And communist parties today are Stalinist, nationalist, stale and conservative. To be in the Communist Party in 1920 was to be a revolutionary socialist, to want to tear the head off the system, to want to see a world run by workers through workers' councils, Soviets as they were called in Russia. And by the end of 1920, Germany had a Communist Party with 350,000 members, France 150,000 members, Czechoslovakia, now the Czech and Slovak republics, 170,000 members. But Lenin and the Russian leadership, who had enormous authority within the movement, but not by any means control, faced challenges on two fronts. On the one hand, they faced a challenge to the right. There were a series of parties who were gravitating towards the Communist International, the international grouping of revolutionary socialist parties known as the Comintern. And these parties were centrist. And by that is meant that they talked left, they talked revolutionary, but in essence were reformists. And they would vacillate between the two kinds of languages and the two kinds of politics. And Lenin was quite concerned that communism, revolutionary socialism, was becoming dangerously fashionable by early 1920s, that it was becoming trendy to identify with the October Revolution and trendy to want to join the Communist International. And so the Russian leadership put up a proposal that each party joining the Communist International would have to agree to 21 conditions with the intention of weeding out the reformist parties. It didn't work completely, but nonetheless it was an attempt to deal with that problem. But the other challenge that they faced, and this is the purpose of this pamphlet, was that there was a mass of enthusiastic but inexperienced revolutionaries who wanted to push on as soon as possible for socialist revolution everywhere, regardless of the circumstances. And by the way, when it says infantile in the title, there is an element in which Lenin is being rude to his opponents, but there's also a sense he was actually describing a phenomenon where people were simply inexperienced. They hadn't gone through the process of building revolutionary socialist parties, winning support inside the working class movement. And he put a premium on knowledge, experience, and flair and insight. And it's in that sense he was criticising his opponents as being infantile. They had not yet learnt some of the skills that were necessary to make a revolution. Now, the left communists pushed a number of arguments, some of which are familiar today, some a little bit less so. They argued that there could be no compromise in the struggle. To compromise was reformist. They argued that there could be no participation in parliamentary activity or even in the unions. Yet for others who gravitated into what Lenin referred to as left communism, for others there was a rejection of the party on the basis that the revolution would come about through workplace and union organising. And the stakes in this debate were very, very high. In March 1920, so 1 month before this pamphlet is produced, the German military launched a putsch, an attempted military takeover, an attempt to overthrow the new bourgeois democratic government in Berlin that was dominated by members of the SPD, the Socialist Party, quite left in their language, certainly compared to the Albaneses of today, but thoroughly wedded to continuing the system. and the military launched a coup. They basically wanted a military dictatorship and the overthrow of the government which had emerged out of the end of the revolutionary upheaval at the end of the First World War. And the leaders of the Communist Party, the KPD, declared neutrality between, quote unquote, two counter-revolutionary gangs. The proletariat, they declared, will not lift a finger for the Democratic Republic. Their ultra-leftism meant that they couldn't or wouldn't tell the difference between a bourgeois democratic republic where workers had space and legitimacy to organise and the left could do likewise, and a military government. For them, both of them were capitalist, both of them were to be rejected. Now, thankfully, the vast bulk of the German working class took absolutely no notice of the Communist Party, which was still quite small at this point, and launched a general strike, and there was actually armed resistance in some of the workers' areas, and the Kapp Putsch was defeated. But it's an indication of how important that these debates were. This wasn't a parlour game where one argued for the best possible politics. This was the difference between standing against a military coup or not. And this wasn't the first time that Lenin had to combat this infantile disorder. In the context of debates following the October Revolution, where there was an argument about whether the revolutionary government could cut a peace deal with Germany, what was known as the Brest-Litovsk deal, Lenin had to argue in April 1918 against what he called then left-wing childishness. But this time, as the mass parties were emerging and becoming more and more central to the struggle across Europe, the stakes were much, much higher. So what's the Australian context for this? Well, I think we can safely say there are no centrist parties for whom revolutionary socialism has become fashionable. Solidarity is not being approached by the left wing of the Labour Party with a desire to become one of us. We don't have to worry about that problem. We're not trendy, we're not fashionable. We're right, but we're not trendy and we're not fashionable. Today in Australia, there's no serious grouping arguing for abstention from the unions. And I'm open to contradiction on that, but I believe that's the case. But there are certainly many groups and milieus of activists who are influenced by the idea of no compromise and a disdain of parliamentary activity, and if not a rejection of Parliament full stop, certainly a rejection of the Labour Party and relating to the election. So think of the block the dock types of activists who refused to lift the community picket this time last year in Melbourne on the waterfront, where for 4 days the members of the Maritime Union respected the picket line, which was being organised against Zim Shipping, the Israeli shipping line, and when the MUA members finally ran out of excuses not to cross that picket line, the majority of people on that picket line said, if they go back to work, they're part of the problem. We won't compromise. We keep on picketing until the police turned up and turned on them with tear gas and rubber bullets. Or think of the unrelenting sectarian hostility to both union officials and Labour members among some of the left. Or think now, in the run-up to a federal election, about the number of activists prepared to say, put Labour last, vote Labour out, as if a Dutton government was of no consequence. And unbelievably, that includes some of the quite senior officials who are responding to Labour putting the CFMEU into administration. And then it comes up in another variant, which is the elitist morality of the chant, while you're shopping, bombs are dropping, that we often hear on the Sunday rallies, as if the working class people having a bit of time out, with their families, doing a bit of retail therapy if they can afford it, as if they are the problem, as opposed to the ruling class. Now, on compromise, Lenin's starting point was that revolutionary socialists need to assess situations concretely. Sometimes you have no choice but to compromise, and you judge that compromise on whether or not it sets you up for a better and more effective fight against the boss and the boss class in the future. And he used a very simple metaphor, which is you're driving through the countryside, you're in your car, you're held up by bandits, they put a gun to your head and say, give us your money, give us your car. Nowadays they'd say, give us your phone, give us your sneakers, or else we'll blow your brain out. And he said it is not a compromise to survive to fight another day. That you have to look at it concretely in that regard. This is to quote him: one must be able to analyse the situation and the concrete conditions of each compromise, or each variety of compromise. One must learn to distinguish between a man, gendered language, a person who has given up their money and firearms to the bandits to lessen the evil they can do, and a person who gives their money and firearms to bandits so as to share in the loot. And he moves on from that to talk about the trade union struggle. Because all of us who have been in unions and have gone through struggle know that inevitably, almost without fail, every industrial struggle ends in a compromise. And it doesn't matter how militant you are, it doesn't matter how solid the members are, you reach a certain point where you go, I think we've got the best we can do, and as a leadership you have to recommend the end of the action. It's incredibly rare for workers to win everything they're looking for in a strike. So to go back to work having fought, sometimes lost, but sometimes gained partially, Lenin said that compromise is entirely reasonable because it sets you up to fight again another day. The union official who does a shonky deal to turn off the strike and basically to get themselves some peace and quiet, that compromise is despicable because it sets back the struggle. So to go back to the Melbourne waterfront in January last year, our comrades argued for compromise, to lift the picket after 4 days because the MUA members were no longer in a position to respect it. If that compromise had been accepted, there would have been the opportunity to come back in the weeks or months that followed and try to pull off another concerted action between Free Palestine activists and the MUA. But because the majority argued no compromise, they actually smashed the trust that the Palestine movement had in the eyes of the Maritime Union officials, and a year on we are no more able to consider picketing on the waterfront against a Zim ship than we would have been in many years ago. Rejecting compromise wrecked that work. So let's move on to Lenin on the question of Parliament, but also at some level on the question of labour. The German left communists argued it this way, and Lenin quotes them in the pamphlet: all reversion to parliamentary forms of struggle, which have become historically and politically obsolete, must be emphatically rejected. And they go on to note that millions of workers still follow the Catholic Conservative or Centre Party, and millions or many rural workers are actually part of the shock troops of reaction. And Lenin replied like this: parliamentarianism is of course politically obsolete for the communists in Germany, but, and this is the whole point, we must not regard what is obsolete to us as something obsolete to a class, to the masses. It is obvious that the lefts in Germany have mistaken their desire, their politico-ideological attitude for objective reality. And we see something of this in the left. For us as revolutionary socialists, Parliament is an obsolete form of political organisation. We are fighting for a higher and more complete and thorough form of democratic organisation. Workers' direct control of the workplaces, workers' councils, coordinating and deciding how society should be run. The politics and the economics brought together under direct workers' control. How many people in Australia today would vote for that proposition outside of this room? A few hundred. But as we've established, there are 6 million people as a minimum who will vote for the Labor Party and the Greens Party in April or May, who are completely committed to Parliament being a vital part of the political system. You cannot simply jump over that process. And Lenin pointed out the way that the Bolsheviks, who had enormous authority because they'd actually made a workers' revolution, had engaged in parliamentary activity after the defeat of the 1905 revolution, and even engaged in parliamentary activity in what was known as the Constituent Assembly, which was convened and then dispersed after the October Revolution. Because Lenin's argument was this: unless you are at the point of being able to take power through insurrection, then parliamentary activity is a valid way to reach out to the masses. It's a way of going and arguing to workers that they can and should take control of the situation into their own hands. Now again, you've got to look at this concretely. Solidarity is not engaging in electoral work, as in running an electoral party or standing in elections, but we still engage in electoral debate. In the next few months, everywhere, in every workplace, on every campus, we will be engaging in debates about what will be happening at the coming federal election, and how nowhere will we be arguing for people not to vote and that Parliament doesn't matter, because we know that that element of political activity is of importance. Now, there's only a very small minority of left activists, mostly in the anarchist groups or milieus, the anarcho-communists, who reject Parliament outright, but we know that there are many, many people around us who reject Labour. Not just the leadership or the MPs, but the membership too. Now, even on an objective basis, that's clearly a mistake. We know that there are Labour members and Labour branches which are organising against AUKUS, for Palestine, for the CFMEU, that have won positions at state conferences and at least taken, in the case of AUKUS, the fight onto the floor of the National Conference. For the left communists who are around us today, I'm using that in Lenin's sense of the term, that is a matter of irrelevance. And the Australian left communists, in inverted commas, use radical language against Labour, I would argue, as a compensation for their own weakness. They cannot lead a movement, a real living movement, that brushes aside Labour and Labourism, so they console themselves with shaking their puny fists at Albanese and the Labour Party. And it's something that Lenin recognised, and again, to quote the pamphlet, it's very easy to show one's, quotes, revolutionary temper merely by hurling abuse at parliamentary opportunism. And by opportunism, he meant reformism. Or merely by repudiating participation in parliaments. Its very ease, however, cannot turn this into a solution of a very difficult problem. And that problem, and it faces us every day, is how do we as a minority, a revolutionary minority, reach out to and convince the mass of workers who are a million miles away from revolutionary politics at this point. Now, Lenin was arguing, you could argue, at the dawn of reformism, and he wanted, in the pamphlet he talks about the British Labour Party and so on. He wanted Labour-type politics to win so it could be exposed. So of course there are people today who will say, well, hang on, hasn't Labour been exposed and exposed and exposed and exposed? And they're absolutely right. Except I think they ignore three phenomena which are interlinked. The first is that reformism is not a product of reformist parties. It's the other way around. Reformist parties reflect reformist consciousness. And reformist consciousness is the default position for the best sections of the working class, because they simultaneously reject capitalism, they know the world is bad, they worry about the world that their kids will inherit, but at the same time they feel there is little or nothing that they can do to act in order to change the world, and therefore they look to the union officials or they look to the Labour Party. Those illusions are born and reborn over and over again, not least just because there's a process of life and death. People who learnt the lesson once pass on, and other people come along who have to learn it again from scratch. And there's always that hope that however bad the Labour Party might be, or however weak from time to time the Greens, as a left-wing version of the Labour Party to some degree, might be, that they might somehow save us. And so you look at the CFMEU campaign, for instance, and we find in Melbourne, there are individual activists who have resigned from the Labor Party in disgust over the CFMEU being put in administration. Simultaneously, there are serious union activists, and we're all together in the Defend the CFMEU campaign, serious union activists who are joining the Labor Party because they are hoping that somehow they can change the party from within, or at least shift its policy on the question of the CFMEU. And you talk to refugees at the encampments and you'll find people who, 3 years ago at the last election, handed out for Labor in the hope that something would change for refugees. Many of them probably won't do it again this time. Others will say things will be so much worse under Dutton that we'll hand out for Labor all over again. Illusions keep on being reborn. So I'm beginning to come to a conclusion on this. Lenin's central argument is this: a revolutionary minority cannot substitute themselves for the mass of the working class. And there are two more brief examples from Germany which bear this out. In January 1919, the very young, the very infantile Communist Party, which was also quite small at this point, maybe 3,000 members, voted for insurrection, overruled its own leadership and declared it would lead an insurrection. It was an insurrection that was smashed, and as a result, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were the two greatest minds of the German working class and revolutionary socialist movement, were murdered and thrown into a Berlin canal. In 1921, again, the left communists said, we need to push things forward. We will, in March 21, we will launch an insurrection. Again, isolation and defeat, and in the short term at least, a decline in the forces of the Communist Party. If you cannot bring with you the mass of workers, then revolution simply isn't on the cards. And in fact, any of us in a union context know if you can't bring the mass of workers with you, strike action isn't on the cards. It's a very simple lesson. So Lenin put it like this in the pamphlet: victory cannot be won with the vanguard alone. To throw only the vanguard, so the vanguard is the advanced section of the class, the revolutionary socialists in particular, into the decisive battle before the entire class, the broad masses have taken up a position either of direct support for the vanguard or at least of sympathetic neutrality, would not just be foolish but criminal. Propaganda and agitation alone are not enough for an entire class. The broad masses of working people, those oppressed by capital, it's not enough for them to take such a stand. For that, the masses must have their own political experience. Such is the fundamental law of all great revolutions. And that argument from Lenin in 1920 foreshadows the arguments put forward by Trotsky to the Comintern in 1921 and 1922 about the necessity for revolutionaries to seek out united fronts with reformists in order to fight the capitalists in primarily defensive struggles and to open up a broader field of potential for the revolutionary socialists to grow their influence. So in a nutshell, today we have to be the strongest critics of Labour, but we need to continue to maintain an orientation to that significant section of the working class that still looks to Labour. With Lenin, we share the view that the masses can only learn through experience and that we need to be alongside workers. So we stand with them against Dutton in a few months' time, arguing that we should vote Greens 1, Labour 2, but our main task is not to win votes. And in fact, as a small organisation, we will influence the election not one jot or tittle. Our main task is not to win votes, it's to argue that the struggle in the workplace, on the campuses and the streets is essential if we are to win real change and to pose a threat to the system.